Okay, today's video is going to cover solving systems of elimination with multiplication, building off of solving systems of elimination just by adding, except we're adding in a first step. So we've kind of already explored this new skill when we saw examples from adding that look like this. 6x plus 2y equals -5, and we had 6x minus 3y equals 10, where our goal was to add down and eliminate one of the variables. Well, in order for one of the variables to eliminate, we need the coefficients, or the numbers in front of one of the variables, to add up to 0. So you can see here, the opposite numbers always add to 0. So when we saw this on the homework from the previous lesson, we had to multiply one of these equations by a -1 in order to create that opposite, because the opposite of a +6 is a -6, and when we multiplied one of the equations by -1, that 6 went from a positive to a negative, and we got something like 3y equals -10, and then we brought down 6x plus 2y equals -5, and we added straight down. So this is exactly what we're going to do in today's lesson, except in today's lesson you're not going to be given numbers where all you have to do is multiply by -1 to create the opposite. So if you look over here at example number 1, you can see that the numbers in front of x are -2 and 4, and the numbers in front of y are -6, and you can go ahead and put in a +1 in front of the y. So how do we create opposites when the numbers aren't 6 and 6, or when they're not given to us? Well, it's fairly easy. So if you look at the numbers in front of x, you've got -2 and you've got 4. Well, the opposite of a 4 would be a -4, and the opposite of a -2 would be a +2. So you're thinking in your head, okay, well, what do I need to multiply -2 by to get to a -4? Well, a negative times a positive would be a negative, so some positive number, and 2 times 2 would be 4. So if I multiply -2 by +2, the result would be a -4. So I could multiply this top equation by a +2 to create the opposite in the x. Or, what could I multiply 4 by to get a +2? Well, this one's a little bit more challenging because you'd have to multiply 4 by 1/2 to get to a +2. So far, the easiest number to multiply by is a +2. Well, what if you wanted to create the opposites in y? And when you can create them in y as well, the numbers you have for y are -6 and a +1, and the opposites of those numbers would be a -1 and a +6. Well, multiplying 1 is like the easiest one. So 1 times what would give you a +6? 1 times 6 would give you a +6. And then multiplying -6 by what number? Well, negative times a positive would be a negative. And then you'd have to multiply by a +1/6 to get a -1. So multiplying by fractions, probably not your best bet. So you can go ahead and rule those out. So we can either multiply by a 2 or we can multiply by a 6. I suggest multiplying by a 2 because multiplying by a 2 is a lot easier than multiplying by a 6. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to take this top equation and we're going to multiply it by 2. So our first step here is to multiply to create opposite, and I'm going to give you a mathematical word. Instead of opposite numbers, what we're doing is we're multiplying to create opposite coefficients, and those are numbers in front of variables. So let's multiply this top equation. We get -4x minus 12y equals a +20, and then we can bring down 4x plus y equals -9. So now that we have our opposites, 4 and -4, we can go ahead and just add straight down. So negative 4 and 4, those add to 0, x. Negative 12 plus 1y is a negative 11y. And 20 plus a negative 9 is a positive 11. So we can go ahead and cross out 0x because 0 times x is 0, and 0 minus negative 11y is just negative 11y. So now we're just going to solve. So step 2, we add equations to eliminate. And step 3 is we solve. So we're solving here. We're going to divide both sides by negative 11. And we get y equals a negative 1. Now that we know what y is, we can go back in and we can put negative 1 in for y. And we're going to use the equation that we originally multiplied. So y is now negative 1. So we've got negative 6 times negative 1. And we're going to solve for x. So I'm going to do that side work right here. So we have negative 2x minus 6 times negative 1 equals 10. And by using this original equation that we multiplied, it will make sure that the number we got for y is in fact a solution. Now we're going to simplify. So we've got positive 6. And now we can do inverse operations. We're going to minus minus, and we get negative 2x equals a 4. And then we can go ahead and divide by negative 2. Divide by negative 2, and we're left with x equals a negative 2. And our coordinate point here can be written as negative 2, comma, negative 1. So just to review what the steps were, this last one was to substitute and then solve. So step 1, we created the opposite. So this was step 1 when we multiplied this 2 to the top equation. In step 2, we added the two equations. So adding these two equations straight down was our second step. Step 3 was we solved for the variable that was left over after we added the equations. And then step 4 was we substituted the value that we got for that variable into the equation that we originally multiplied, and we solved for the last variable. Let's go over one more example. So here we have example 2. We know that our first step is going to be to multiply. To create opposites. So what number is going to help us create these opposites? Or which equation do we need to multiply? So we've got a negative 4, we've got a negative 2 in front of x, and then negative 6 and negative 4 for y. So the opposite of a 2 would be a negative 2 would be a 2, and the opposite of a negative 4 would be a positive 4. So what could we multiply a negative 4 by to get a positive 2? Well, obviously we'd have to multiply by negative. Negative times negative would give us a positive. And then we'd have to multiply by 1/2 in order to get to 2. So multiplying by a fraction in this top equation will give us a positive 2 in front of x. Or we could multiply by, let's see, negative would give us a positive, and then 2 times 2 would give us a 4. Or we can multiply this bottom equation by negative 2 to get a positive 4. This bottom equation is probably the easier one to multiply. But before we do that, let's look at y. Is there anything easier that we can multiply to create the opposite in y? So for y, we've got a negative 6 and a negative 4. And the opposites of those would be a positive 4 and a positive 6. So you can see here that in order to get negative 6 to positive 4, we'd have to multiply by some fraction. And likewise with this negative 4. Because neither of these numbers is a factor of the other, whereas 2 is a factor of 4. So eliminating y first here is not our most efficient option. So let's go ahead and multiply by -2 to create the opposite in front of x. When we multiply by -2, we can go ahead and bring that top equation down so that top equation stays the same. And now we can multiply through this bottom equation. So we get positive x, 4x, we get a positive 8y, and we get a -24. Now it's important here to understand what the justification would be to go from the -2x minus 4y equals 12 to a 4x plus 8y equals -12. Well, why can we just multiply this equation? We've learned about this property that allows us to, multiply both sides by any number that we want. So AP or MPE would be the justification for our first step. Now that step 1's complete, we can go ahead and move into step 2, where we just add the two equations straight down. We know that our opposite numbers are going to add up to 0, and then we have -6 plus 8 is a positive 2y equals 16 plus a -24 is a -8. We can now solve for y. 0x is just 0, and this is just a 2y, so we're going to divide by 2, and we get y equals a -4. So we divided both sides in order to get the -4. And then I guess we added these two equations, so here we would add by elimination. Now that we know what y is, we can go in back to our original equation that we multiplied and put in for y a -4. So let's go ahead and solve for x now. So we've got -2x minus 4 times -4 equals 12. -4 times -4 is 16. And now we can use inverse operations. We got -2x equals a -4, and we can divide by -2, divide by -2, and we've got x equals +2. Our coordinate point here is going to be 2, -4. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through the justifications, and I know I kind of did as we were going through them, but I didn't do a great job. So let's go ahead and run through those real quick. So we've got our first step here. Our first step here was we multiplied this bottom equation. So we used the multiplicative property of equality to multiply both sides, this left side and the right side. And then what we did was we added straight down the equations. So we added by elimination. And then we solved for y, and the first thing that we did in solving was we divided both sides by 2. After we figured out what y was, we substituted y into the original equation. And then after we substituted, the first thing that we did was we simplified this multiplication. And then we subtracted both sides. And then we divided both sides. And we got our answer. So those are the justifications for what we did today. Good luck on the problem set.